Welcome all. We are here at the 36th Annual Winter Conference at Worcester State. And you are participating in the Influence Plant Development Using Homemade Mineral Amendments with Nigel Palmer. Before we get started, I just want to go over a few slides here. We are presenting this in unceded Nipmuc land. This is a slide where you can actually look as to what land you occupy. So I highly encourage everyone to actually go to this website and look at this map and familiarize yourself with this map. Another slide that I want to bring up is our racial equity and food system. These are some of the BIPOC-led organizations, which you can, I won't read them out loud. You can actually see which one those are. But I do want to bring up that there is a BIPOC and White Ally Caucus happening today from 1 to 2. That unfortunately will only be in person. And that's going to be held at the Sheenan Hall dining room. I also want to bring up our sponsors. Without their sponsorship, this winter conference would not be possible. I also want to bring up the auction. There's an online auction happening right now. Please visit it. There's a lot of great materials in there, and they typically go fast, and there's a lot of competition over them. So try to hit those up. And with that, I will lead you to Nigel Palmer and a little bit about Nigel here. So Nigel is a regenerative grower's guide to garden amendments. He is a lifelong gardener relying on the amazing complexity of nature to inspire his gardening practices. We all are experimental growers giving a new canvas each year. He develops curriculum for and instructs the Sustainable Regenerative Garden Program at the Institute of Sustainable Nutrition. So with that, I leave you with Nigel Palmer here.
Oh, great. Thanks so much for that. The words kind of got gobbled, but actually I am the author of the book, The Regenerative Grower's Guide to Garden Amendments. And yeah, so that's that. So I guess I wanted to start by telling you that I live on the land of the Massico, and these were the people that lived in this part of the world. I live in Connecticut in West Granby, and the Massico had this land years ago. And when settlers showed up, there was a dude by the name of John Griffin who was making products for the boating industry. And one of the main products being made in this part of the world was tar that was used to seal boats. And the native man burnt a large quantity of this tar and was arrested for it and was fined 914.4 meters of wampum. Well, I don't know about you, but 914 meters of anything is more than I have around. And that was true of the local people at the time. And so the local leader, political leader of the people that lived here, they deeded a large amount of land to Mr. Griffin. It was called the Massico Divide. And it includes lands around Canton, Simsbury, and Granby, where I live. And there's another book that I really think is very interesting on this subject, and it's called Manitou. This is a really, really fun book. And what it talks about is the rock formations all around New England. And most university discussions about rock formations talk specifically about rock walls and things like that. Well, in fact, there are some really amazing structures all around New England. And they're these beautiful archaeological stone structures, things with like a chamber, an underground chamber with a long tube, if you will, of rocks that actually allows sunlight to come in and hit the back of the wall at the solstice or at the equinox. And these rock formations all around New England show a very clear understanding of geological and astrological events. And clearly people use these rocks to determine times of year for migrating, planting, whatever people in that time did. So I've gone around. I live here in New England in the hills, and I love walking in the woods. And I've actually seen some of these things, and I highly recommend looking into that. And the next time you're wandering around the woods and you see a rock at the top of a hill, perched at the top of a hill, think about, well, how did it get there? And was it actually put there? And some of the other things that you might find in the woods. So real cool book, Manitou. Highly recommend it, learning about some of the rock formations around New England that have been here for over 1,000 years. Okay, so today I'm going to talk about foliar spraying, the magic of foliar spraying. Before I start, I wanted to understand how many people know what foliar spraying is. You guys, I can actually see the room. All right, a lot of people know what foliar spraying here is good. And so I have one of my foliar sprayers here, and here's another foliar sprayer, right? And I got a couple more. But the point I want to make here is when I do this, right, I'm talking about foliar spraying. So remember that. That's essentially what it is. Foliar spraying is nothing more than spreading a fine mist onto the leaf. And so what I'd like to do now is talk about this presentation material that I have and focus on the magic of foliar spraying. So I'm going to share my screen. And let's see, where do I go? Share. And you should be able to see my screen. So I can't see any of you. So would somebody say, yeah, I can see it?
Yes, I can see it.
Perfect. Thank you. So today I'm going to talk about the magic of foliar spraying using homemade mineral amendments. And this is specifically a short-term mineralization strategy. I'll allude to some of the long-term strategies that are out there, fixing your soil, mineralization, mulching, composting, and things like that, adding biology, making sure the biology is strong, and how to increase that biological diversity. But today I'm really going to focus on this short-term mineralization strategy using foliar sprays. And this is the sequence of discussions that I'm going to put forward. First, I'm going to talk about my experience growing food, and then I'm going to talk about a soil plant model. And soil models in general are really, really important. And the reason models are important is because we use them as a context to put other information in to explain and make decisions. A lot of people, when they come to a red light, they stop their car. They actually stop. It doesn't matter if there's any people or cars around. They just stop, and they'll sit there at this red light, even though there's no traffic anywhere around. And when the light turns green, they go. They don't even look left or right. And what's going on here is they have this model in their mind. And the same is true for growing food. And most of us don't have the basis of a sound plant model, soil plant model that we can use to make decisions. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about this soil plant model and the interaction of minerals and biology in the soil. And then I'm going to talk about making homemade mineral amendments. My book is really a recipe book with biological and mineral amendments in it. And I'm going to focus specifically on these mineral amendments, and we'll learn that we can make all of the mineral amendments we need with all of the 18 minerals that are in there just about for free using simple kitchen chemistry at home. And then I'm going to go back to this model discussion, and I'm going to talk about plant sap flows and how you can feed plants by two different methodologies, one, the xylem, and the other, the phloem flows. And this will lead us into foliar spraying and actually feeding foliar sprays to our plants using the phloem flow. And we're going to learn a lot about why this is so important, because we're going to find that we're not only feeding the plant, but we're also feeding the soil biology when we do so. And then we're going to take all of these ideas and put them together into this idea of being able to influence the different growth phases of plants as they grow along. And then we'll have a summary of everything, and then we'll have some questions and answers. So I've been a gardener for about 45 years. I've been doing it since my early 20s. And I was pretty much an organic by neglect grower. And I think most of us understand what that means. I rototilled the garden dutifully every year, added cow manure and things like that, but that was pretty well it. I planted seeds and they grew and they worked. And guess what? That tomato that I planted in that way was still better than the one that I bought in the store. And then as I got older, it was fun to teach my children where their food came from and having a garden. And then as I got older, still in our 40s, we recognized that growing food became the best healthcare program available to us. Anybody who reads the labels of those packaged, processed chemical commodities found in the grocery store, some people refer to that as food. Once you read those ingredients, you realize that there's not a lot of food in those packages. And the other thing is not only is they're loaded with chemicals, and then you've got all the sides and the GMOs and all the other toxic things going on. And so the best healthcare program around is to eliminate all that stuff and basically grow your own. It's the only way that I have found that I can eliminate these nasty things that are in the food system. Organic is a great alternative, but organic now is a 700-page document that is pretty well controlled by the government, and it will limit the probability of ingesting some of these sides and other nasty things, but it certainly doesn't guarantee that you're not going to get them. And so it became very clear to me and my wife that growing our own food was indeed the best healthcare program that we had available to us. And so now I went about trying to figure out, well, how do I change my plant model? How do I move from rototilling and putting manure on my garden to something different and something that made more sense and used a little bit more of the knowledge that people have about growing that's out there today? And so one of the first things I learned was that I needed 18 minerals in my soil, and those minerals needed to be in specific proportions. By the way, that number of minerals increases as time goes on, as we learn more and more about the intricacies of these minerals in the soil. But the next thing I learned was that the proportions of these minerals mattered. And so cations, calcium and magnesium, needed to be in very high percentages, where some of them needed to be in moderate amounts, like sulfur, silicon, manganese, and iron. And some needed to be in really, really small amounts, 0.5 parts per million. Okay, well, parts per million kind of threw me, and it's like, okay, I know that's really small, but 0.5 parts per million, how am I going to spread 0.5 parts per million molybdenum on my field or my garden? Where am I going to find all this stuff, right? How am I going to find cobalt sustainably? How am I going to find boron and copper and molybdenum and silicon and all of these things in a sustainable manner? And then how am I going to spread them on my garden in a nice uniform manner? And how am I going to get them into forms that plants can actually use? Well, so anybody who's done a soil test, the first thing you realize when you do a soil test is that your minerals are probably not in a nice balanced form. And that's probably due to geological history more than anything else, but it's also due to past practices in the field. And then if we start talking about biology, we're going to realize that the biology is way out of whack too, for similar reasons. So the first thing I recognized when I found these minerals was, how am I going to find these minerals sustainably? How am I going to spread them in uniformly? And how am I going to get them in forms that plants can actually use? Well, so the next thing I learned about was soil biology. And those of you in the room, my guess is some of you have a really clear understanding about the need for soil biology and how important soil biology is for its functions of decomposing all of the rocks and plants and things that are in there, but also the ecology of these animals in the soil and the poop and dead bodies that they create as life goes on. And all of that poop and dead bodies is the nutrition that gets into the soil solution that feeds our plants. Well, so I started learning more about biology. And the first thing I learned is we only know about 10% of the names of the fungus and bacteria that's in our soil, never mind what they do or their interactions. And then I learned that there's this thing called archaea out there. And archaea was first discovered in the 1970s in the geysers of Yellowstone Park under very high temperature sulfur environments. But they seem to be thriving there. And then they were found in the bottom of the ocean, high pressure, no light. And they were thriving there. And they were thought originally to be kind of extreme biological bacteria that was living there. And it wasn't until the late 90s, the mid to late 90s, that they realized that archaea is a life form, a brand new life form that was identified. And we had to go and change all the charts to talk about life forms. And subsequent to that, we find that archaea is ubiquitous and it's throughout the soil, and it is contributing to nitrogen fixation and many of the other fundamental aspects of soil. So all of this biology just blew me away. And so then I was thinking about good and bad biology and realized that there's no such thing as good and bad biology. There's only balance. And the key is to keep the soil biology in check. And the way you do that is through diversity. And it's the diversity of the soil biology that keeps everything in check, because everything has to compete for those resources. And then the next thing I learned that fairly recently was work by a gentleman by the name of James White. And he has actually shown that the seeds have bacteria in them. And as the seed grows into a plant, this bacteria is in the root structure and is actually distributed from the root structure into the soil and allowed to go and gather nutrients. And then it is reabsorbed by the root structure and digested to feed the plant. So now we see that plants are actually extending those root hairs and those roots in order to mine different minerals in the soil, not only with the bacteria that actually is in them from the get-go, but also in symbiotic relationships with the fungus and archaea and other bacteria that's in the soil. This was just absolutely mind-bendingly cool. And then realizing that many of their agricultural practices actually deplete the soil biology, recognizing that as I was rototilling that garden and ripping up all the fungi, mycelium, and destroying all of these ecosystems, all these bacteria, and also recognizing that when anybody decides to go and use a side, whether it's a fungicide, herbicide, or pesticide, they think that, well, I'm just spraying this on and I'm going to get rid of this aphids. That's all I'm doing is killing the aphids. But no, you're actually killing significant aspects of the soil ecology. And so this whole idea of killing rather than nurturing the food system, the soil ecology was really a mind-blowing for me. Then the next thing was recognizing that all this biology needs housing and nutrition. And this gets into some of the long-term programs of providing carbon. Our soils need carbon, not nitrogen. A lot of people think they need to add nitrogen to the soil, but in fact, it's carbon that is the most important element to add to the soil. The carbon will break down into humus through the fungi that breaks it down, humification, and this humus provides housing, and the carbon also provides nutrition. And then finally, the next thing that was absolutely fantastic was recognizing that the plants feed the soil biology. And this is kind of where we're going with this whole foliar spray thing. We recognize now that the plant might feed the soil as much as 25% of the sugars that it creates during photosynthesis. So plant root exudates are feeding the soil biology. The soil biology is decomposing minerals into plant available forms that they can use, and then feeding them back to the plants, so that we have this symbiotic relationship in the soil of plants feeding the soil. So we recognize now that the soil is the plant's digestive system. Just as we have a digestive system that's loaded with bacteria and things like that, so is the soil the digestive system for plants. So the next thing I learned was really amazing to me. Once you get all of these systems going, once you get the soil biology thriving and you have the minerals that a plant needs, now that plant has the ability to put forth the energies to build itself up. And the first thing it does is produces lipids, and that's that glossy, shiny layer on the leaf of a plant, and that will eliminate airborne pathogens from bothering the plant, because those airborne pathogens land on the leaf and they have to go through that fat layer, that lipid layer, and they can't. It's much more difficult to do so. And so now the plant has an ability to thwart airborne pathogens. As more and more of these compounds become available, now the plant increases its sugar content, and it will have resistance to insect pressure because many insects don't have the gut enzymes to digest these sugars. In fact, you can determine the Brix level of your plant by the bugs that are eating it. If you have things like aphids and things like that that are eating your plants, then your plants are going to Brix at about 6 or 7, 8. If you have chewing insects eating your plants, you've moved up the scale a little bit. You're almost there, and you're going to have plants that Brix in the 10, 11 range. And once you get your Brix levels higher still, then these insect pressures just absolutely go away. And then the next thing that became clear was, and this goes back to the health portion of the whole thing, is once these plants get to these levels, now they're actually able to produce the secondary metabolites that we're looking for our health, the antioxidants and the phytonutrients and things like that. So now when I'm going to buy blueberries for the antioxidants of those blueberries, if those blueberries come from plants that aren't very healthy, then those antioxidants are not going to be there. It's only in the healthy plants that have these sugars, that have all of this system going, that will be able to produce those antioxidants. And so now it becomes clear that if I really want healthy food with these secondary metabolites in them, I have to eat healthy plants. And so this is why growing your own plants and knowing the health of those plants and increasing the health of those plants is the best healthcare program available. And then finally, the last thing I wanted to talk about is that plant minerals needs change. Just like human beings, when we're young, we have a certain set of nutrition requirements as we go through our first years of our life. Well, when we're teenagers, we need a different set of minerals. When we're reproducing, we need a different set of minerals. And when we're older, we need a different set of minerals as well. And so plants also have this same tendency. They need different minerals throughout their developmental phases. And we're going to talk about that in a minute. And we're going to use this idea to figure out how to best feed plants. Now, what's interesting is that this whole root exudate thing is the way the plant feeds different biology in order to get the nutrients that it needs to satisfy those mineral needs throughout its growing cycle. And we're going to take advantage of that. So now we talked about long-term strategies: never leave the soil bare, cover crops, crop rotation, mulches, rock dust, compost, all of these things. But these things take years or months at least in order for them to take place and to improve the soil. And so what I wanted to talk about here, remember that? Foliar spraying, that's what we're talking about here. And foliar spraying is the short-term strategy for feeding your plants when you know your soil's not right, when you know there are other problems, other stresses on a plant, whether it be poor soil biology or water or whatever it might be. Foliar spraying is the thing that gives us a short-term strategy. And so we're going to learn to nurture nature using the things that are at our fingertips rather than outsmarting it and trying to kill things. And so that's what this whole program's about. So there's your soil model, and I hope that helped a little bit and put things in perspective. And so now I want to talk about homemade mineral amendments. And a couple of the recipes that are in my book are fermented plant juices and vinegar extractions. These are old ideas. Korean natural farming talks about them. Many people have been doing these things for thousands of years, rotting plants in a bucket. And what I want to do is try and make them simple and approachable. And the first thing is to make it clear how simple this stuff is. We're talking about kitchen chemistry here. Very simple tools. We're talking about jars and sieves and scales and pens and labels and sugar and vinegar. Very, very low cost. In fact, in some cases, there's no cost at all. And there's no environmental detriment either. In fact, a lot of times we're going to be closing the waste gaps. We're actually going to be using waste products in order to make some of these mineral amendments. And we're going to learn how amazing they are. Not only that, they're very high dilution rates. So when we make a 1 quart jar of one of these mineral amendments, we're going to dilute it 500 to 1. So that's 500 quarts. So we're going to have 125 gallons of a shelf-stable, water-soluble, broad mineral spectrum compounds that plants can absorb directly. And so these are sustainable. This is a sustainable methodology of coming up with minerals to feed your plants. And so let's talk about them a little bit. So here we're going to talk about fermented plant juice. And the fundamental idea here is a little bit of a nuance, and I want to talk about it a little bit. And the bottom line is that plants accumulate minerals in different proportions than the soil mineral proportions. So what this says is that the soil, remember we went and did our soil test and we found out it was all not what Albrecht suggests we need for a nice balanced soil, right? And we go, oh my gosh, what am I going to do? And we go on this long-term program in order to fix that. Well, weeds and plants, they absorb minerals in different proportions than is in the soil. When we have weeds growing in our garden or in our fields, the weeds are telling us something. The weeds are actually accumulating minerals within their structure that's different in the soil. And when those weeds die at the end of the season, they're depositing those minerals onto the surface. And so weeds are nature's way of bringing minerals, the right kind of minerals, to the surface of the land and then depositing them onto the land for the next generation to grow. And in fact, when you start mineralizing your soils, you're going to find that the weeds in your garden change. Well, so now we recognize weeds are mineral accumulators. Let's figure out how we can use that to our advantage. Well, the first thing I want to talk about is what is the best thing to feed a plant? And I like to use the example of a tomato. So let's say I grow a tomato and I don't happen to pick that Brandywine tomato off the plant. Instead, I let it fall on the ground, as would happen in nature. Well, now that tomato fruit has all the seeds in it, and the following year, those seeds are going to grow, but they will be nurtured by the tomato fruit. And so this gives the idea of why not ferment the fruit and then have a jar of shelf-stable tomato fermented plant juice to feed the plant in the following year. What a great idea. And so I started doing that. I started fermenting all kinds of different plants. And then I decided that I should analyze them. And this chart that you see here is the analysis of some of the fermented plant juices that I've made. And you can see on the top, you see chlorine, sulfur, potassium, phosphorus, calcium, magnesium, potassium, sodium, boron, iron, manganese, copper, zinc, aluminum, cobalt, molybdenum, silicon, selenium, and nickel. And if you look at the stinging nettle leaf that I went and fermented and did analysis on, all of the minerals are there. This was just fantastic because now I recognize I know where to find molybdenum. I know where to find manganese. I know where to find boron. All I have to do is ferment the plants that I have available in my backyard, weeds in a lot of instances, for just about free, and I get all the minerals that I need. And they're in proportions that plants need. So that fermented tomato juice that I made, not only does it have all of these minerals in it, but it also has them in proportions that tomatoes want. And so I don't have to guess what to feed my tomatoes next year. I don't have to go and figure out where to get cobalt. I don't have to figure out where to go and get manganese. I know it's all there because I've done the analysis and I show that it's all there and it's in proportions that the tomato wants. And these are all water soluble. So when I foliar spray, remember this is a conversation about foliar spraying, right? Foliar spraying? Right. My tomato fermented plant juice on my tomato plants, I know I'm getting that tomato all of the nutrition that it needs. That's fun. So I don't have to guess anymore. This was just so empowering for me. I couldn't even believe it. So the next thing I wanted to talk about was vinegar extractions. And vinegar extractions were something that we used to do in elementary school. We'd take eggshells and throw them in a jar of vinegar and they'd bubble and we'd go ooh and ah and then we'd go away. And sometimes we'd put the whole egg in there and it would soften up and then we'd take the egg and stuff it into a jar through a really tight hole and then there'd be an egg in a jar and ooh, how did that get there? And all these sorts of things. Well, it never dawned on me back then that what I was doing was extracting minerals from that egg using the weak acid of the vinegar. And I would have a solution that would be loaded with minerals. In fact, this is a strategy that many people use for their own health, whether it be bone broths or eggshells or oyster shells or shrimp shells or many of the other products that might be in your backyard and available for free. And this gives us an opportunity to close waste gaps. In fact, I have a relationship with a local restaurant and they save their oyster shells and their shrimp shells for me rather than throw them away. And I use them as a mineral amendment for my garden. You could go to a local butcher shop or a fish market, or if you live near the ocean, or if you live near a plant that has chickens and feathers and wool from sheep, or many of these other resources. So what this is doing, I hope, is opening up your mind to what's in your backyard and how can you close waste gaps to make these very, very important extractions using vinegar. In fact, you can make your own vinegar. Here in New England, there's apples are easily come across, and you can find an abandoned apple tree or something like that, and you can make your own vinegar. So you can do this for absolutely no money if you want and close waste gaps. So as with the fermented plant juices, I decided that I needed to do the analysis on these different extractions. And you can see that there's cow bones, oyster shells, and eggshells. And what I want to bring your attention to is the phosphorus that's in the cow bones. 509 parts per million phosphorus, 1,691 parts per million calcium. These are huge sources of calcium and phosphorus, and even the magnesium up in the 454 parts per million. And then when we look at the oyster shells, the calcium has 6,422 parts per million calcium. So all of a sudden, I have a mineral amendment that not only has all 18 of the minerals in it, but I also have really high amounts of phosphorus and calcium, which we're going to learn are really, really important. This chart at the bottom shows that multiple extractions of the same bones can actually increase some of the quantities of minerals. I bring your attention to the boron. Here's boron, and you can see that the first vinegar extraction got 1.89 parts per million, but the second vinegar extraction gave 2.3 parts per million. And I've seen this repeatedly. Boron, for some reason, comes out stronger in subsequent extractions. So now I have a way to actually increase specific minerals of specific extractions by doing multiple extractions. So you can see this toolbox of specific minerals from specific plants or specific bones and shells and specific processes enable me to start dialing in a mineral amendment toolbox that I can use to feed my plants. All right. So I'm going to go back to the plant soil model here for a little bit and talk about feeding plants. And so most of us know about feeding plants, and we think of watering plants, for instance. Well, when we water plants, we're putting water into the soil solution, whether it's irrigation, fertigation, watering can, whatever it might be. We're essentially dumping water onto the soil. Well, a lot of that water is going to go into the soil and go right past the root structure and go somewhere. Some of that water is going to actually get into the soil solution, and then it's going to go through the xylem flow pathway. And this is a one-way flow that goes from the roots primarily out of the leaves and the stoma of the leaves, is going to then go into the atmosphere. Now, on a really hot day, hot sunny day in the summertime, there's a huge amount of energy moving this water out of the leaves because the leaves are nice and lush and wet and the air is dry and hot. So that moisture wants to leave the leaf and go into the air. So this xylem flow is extremely fast and strong in the hot days of the summer. In the nighttime, when the sun goes down, it still happens, but it's to a much lesser extent. But the point is that if I take those mineral amendments in my watering can and I put it on here, most of that mineral amendment is going to go into the soil. It'll feed the soil biology, which is really important, but a lot of it's just going to go right through the soil, depending on how dry it is and what sort of aggregate structure you have in that soil. And it might just disappear into the soil down below. So now we talk about the phloem flow and the idea of photosynthesis occurring on the leaves, and this phloem flow flowing from the leaves to the plant sinks. So this may or may not be a new idea for you, but these plant sinks are really, really important. These are the primary growth areas of the plant. These are the new shoots. So now I've got photosynthesis happening. I've got all these sugars that are created in the leaf, and they go to the new shoots to expand the plant and make it bigger and have more leaves. It goes to the fruits for reproduction when reproduction is taking place. So all those nutrients go into the fruits and the seeds. It also goes to the root shoots, which are expanding the root structure underneath. but then it also goes to the root exudates. Do you remember before we talked about that symbiotic relationship where the plant is actually feeding the soil biology? So this phloem flow from the leaves during is actually feeding the soil biology as well. And so this is an amazing thing to keep in mind and recognize that we have two ways to feed a plant. We can feed the plant by watering, but we also have this other option, foliar spraying, where we can actually feed the leaves. But when we do this, not only are we feeding the important growth areas of the plant, the new shoots, the reproductive fruits and seeds, and the roots, but we're also feeding the soil biology through the root exudates. How cool is that? We now have a way to not only feed the plant, but to feed the entire ecosystem that the plant is growing in. That's fun. And so let's talk a little bit about this foliar spraying. And what it is applying a very fine mist onto the leaves. You can also apply it to the stem and the bark. There's also absorption that takes place in the stem and the bark. The absorption is maybe about 15 or 20%. That's what it is on the leaves. But nonetheless, you can feed the plant through the stem and the bark, just like human beings again. Our skin is a way that you can feed human beings that get nutrients into the human body. And how many people have taken an Epsom salt bath, for instance? So that's what's going on. Well, the key here with the foliar spraying is applying a fine mist. You don't want to get the plant wet. You just want that fine mist to land onto the leaves. And you want that fine mist to last as long as possible. You want it to sit on the leaf for as long as possible. Now, what's cool about this is the uptake of those minerals is very quick. It's in minutes or hours. You can actually see the results of a foliar spray in minutes or hours, certainly by the next day, as the plant gets these minerals and just jumps to life and is just so happy that it's gotten it. And so this is the way that we can compensate for those unbalanced soils and the stresses, or for the biology that's lacking in the soil, in a short-term strategy. We don't have to wait the years it might take to build up the soil biology, to build up the organic material in the soil, to build up the mineral content in the soil. We can use foliar spraying throughout the growing season to accommodate this. I'm not going to talk a lot about it, but I use this same philosophical approach for biological amendments. I make a leaf mold biology product. You can also use IMO 2 or 4 in a way to use biology to spray it onto plants to address pest and pathogen problems. But recognize when you do so, the reason that the plant got into trouble in the first place was because of a lack of nutrition. So when you apply biological amendments in this manner, you also have to apply nutrition and mineral amendments in order to bring the plant back up to a healthy state, so you just don't go in the same loop. So here we have the best short-term mineralization strategy for plants. So the best time to foliar spray is before sunset. When you're out and you hear the birds in the morning, that's when you want to do it. And what's going on here is you've got dew on the leaves. The xylem flow is minimum because there's no sun. It's been slowing down all night long and absorbing minerals. And so the absorption of these minerals on the leaf is maximized because they sit on the plant for a long time. They get mixed in with the dew and absorbed through the leaf, and then go ahead and feed the growth areas of the leaf as well as the soil biology. I also take advantage of high humidity, misty days, foggy days, or after a light rain as well in order to apply foliar sprays. In fact, there's papers that show absorption is enhanced by high humidity. The key is to avoid hot days and sunny days when you know that xylem flow is rushing moisture through the plant and out the leaf surface. So if you put a foliar spray onto a very hot leaf, it's just going to evaporate very quickly and leave high concentrations of minerals and spots on your leaf rather than be absorbed into the leaf. The next thing is to recognize that we're feeding the plant in a methodology that is different than that coming out of the soil, and we want to do it regularly. Once we start feeding our plant this way, our plant knows that it's getting the nutrition it needs, and it will respond and go through reproduction and some of the other phases of plant development as a result of this. So we want to do it regularly. We want to do it 7 to 10 days. You can even do it more frequently if you'd like, depending on your energy level and how much mineral amendment you you might have. But it's important to recognize that once we start feeding plants in this way, we want to do it regularly. And then the next thing is I want to go back to this idea of specific mineral concentrations needed during different plant growth phases. And we call these points of influence. And so now I want to talk about the plant development phase and the ability to actually address those phases of influence as you go along using these tools, this toolbox that we've just talked about. So the first thing I want to talk about is germination. And this is the most influential growth phase. It's just like human beings. The first 2 years of a child's life is really determines many of the cognitive skills and the cognitive development of that child. Everybody knows how important it is to make sure that that child receives the best nutrition possible during those first couple of years of development. Well, the same is true for plants. There's all sorts of cell division and development that takes place after germination and as this plant is starting to develop into a full-blown plant. And so we want to make sure that this germination phase is optimized as best possible, not only in temperature, soil temperature, but also in water and mineral availability. And so how do we make sure that happens? Well, let's go back to the example of the tomato, for instance. Some of you make soil blocks. If we were in the room, I'd ask, and some of you would raise your hand, but I can't see you, so I won't bother. But when I make soil blocks for tomatoes, for instance, rather than adding just rainwater to the soil material to make the block, I also add fermented plant juice of tomatoes. So what am I doing? I'm making sure that all the minerals that tomato needs is in that soil block. And so when that little noodle comes off the seed and I start germination and that noodle goes around looking for minerals and nutrient, I know that it's already there. And I'll feed that plant in those first few years a spray of fermented plant juice of tomatoes. And I'll water the soil blocks from the bottom with fermented plant juice of tomatoes. So I am sure that that seed and that plant is getting all the nutrition it needs. And so back to the beginning where I was thinking, well, where the heck am I going to find cobalt and molybdenum and selenium and silicon and boron and manganese and all of these minerals? And how am I going to mix them up into the right proportion? And how am I going to be sure that I'm going to mix it in the right proportion for the plants that I'm feeding? I don't even have to guess anymore. I know, based on the analysis that I've done, that all those minerals are there. They're all in the proportions that the tomato wants. They're all water soluble, and the tomato can use them directly. If I didn't happen to have tomatoes, a fermented plant juice of tomato, I'd use one of the weeds that has a very broad spectrum of minerals in it, something like nettle or dandelion. Those are a couple of my favorites. Not only eating nettle and dandelion is a healthy thing to do, but also recognizing them for their broad spectrum amendments is really important. So the next phase I wanted to talk about is flowering, and I'll go through this rather quickly, but we recognize that during flowering, high amounts of phosphorus is needed for many plants. And if you look at the cow bone vinegar extraction, as we said earlier, that has 509 parts per million phosphorus in it. Not only does it have the phosphorus, but it also has all of the minerals that plants need. And so I might mix a little bit of vinegar extracted cow bones into my foliar spray in order to help a plant through, to facilitate the flowering of a plant. In fact, the picture on the right is some cucumbers that were in my garden one year, and they just would not flower. I'd get that first little bit of flowering, and they just sit there for days and days and days. And finally, I thought, okay, these guys need help. And so I provided them with vinegar extracted cow bone foliar spray, and boom, I got huge, beautiful clusters of flowers. And you can see them there. There's like 5 or 7 different clusters of flowers instantly within a day. And off the plant went to produce some lovely cucumbers. But so this was a way to actually facilitate and stimulate flowering of a plant by using this vinegar extraction of cow bones. Same with fruiting, very similar story. Applying broad spectrum is a great idea, but then in addition, we want to make sure that our fruits get calcium. Calcium is very important for filling fruit. And so I can use vinegar extraction of eggshells or oyster shells in order to get that high amounts of calcium. And you can see in the data that of the analysis that I've done, those oyster shells have 6,422 parts per million calcium, and the eggshells 3,758. So now I have a way to provide my fruiting plants with the extra calcium that they need, along with all of those other 18 minerals that plants need. And so there's another strategy for perennials. As soon as the fruit comes off my perennials, whether it's berries or fruit trees, what I like to do is start feeding them foliar sprays, broad spectrum foliars. And what I'm doing is I'm getting those nutrients into the plant leaves. And what happens to this plant in the fall? Well, it starts moving its energy from the leaves and the upper part of the plant down into the root structure in order to get ready for the following year. So I'm actually able to provide nutrition to this plant, through these trees, through these berries in the fall in an effort to make them more robust and have the minerals that they need in the spring. I can also foliar spray in the winter, and I do winter foliar spraying again through the leaves. And not through the leaves, but through the bark, because I know that there's absorption that takes place in the winter. And I actually have used these for fungal and bacteria control using garlic and Jerusalem artichoke amendments that I make. In fact, those amendments came out of Jadam's book, another great resource. And then I already talked about the flowering fruiting phases of plants. And the same is true here, is to use those phosphorus and calcium sources on my fruit trees when they go through these reproductive phases of growth. The next thing I wanted to talk about is photosynthesis efficiency. And this is a really cool idea, and it brings to light another strategy, and I hope you'll take note of this one. There are many plants that we grow that we're just interested in having photosynthesis efficiency. We don't care about reproduction at this point. We want those lettuces to be green and happy and healthy, and cabbages and garlic and some perennials, the stinging nettle, for instance. I just want it to be healthy so that I can eat it or make a fermented plant juice out of it. And so when you start looking at the minerals that are needed for photosynthesis efficiency, we see magnesium, iron, manganese, and phosphorus as some of those minerals that we want to have a lot of. And so one day I was walking in the woods, and it was about a 50-foot canopy of hardwoods. And way down at the bottom, about 10, 12 feet off the ground, were these sassafras trees. And I looked at these sassafras trees, and they looked so healthy. They had that nice green shine, thick leaves. They looked really, really healthy. And it dawned on me that sassafras must be really good at photosynthesizing. It must have very high photosynthesis efficiency in order to be so lush at the bottom of this canopy. And so what did I do? You got it. I made fermented plant juice of sassafras. And I took this juice and then I analyzed it. And sure enough, those minerals that I wanted are really high phosphorus, high magnesium, high iron, high manganese, and as well as all of the other minerals that are in here. In fact, many of the minerals that I wanted were high in here. And so now I use fermented plant juice of sassafras as a fermented plant juice in order to promote photosynthesis efficiency of my plant. Now, when we get photosynthesis efficiency up, that means more sugars are created at the leaf. And so those more sugars are now distributed to the growth areas of the plant, the new shoots above the ground, the root shoots below the ground, the reproductive fruits and seeds, and the soil biology. So by doing these sorts of things, I'm enhancing not only the whole plant, but also the ecology below the ground. That is really fun. The next thing I want to talk about is seeds. And back in the 1700s, some dude named George Washington recognized this idea of seeds that I really want to make clear to people. And that was that bad seed is robbery of the worst kind. First of all, you got ripped off. You lost the money out of your pocket. The second thing is you made all that effort to put them in the ground and it was lost because the seeds didn't come up. But this is the most important point. This is very, very important. The third thing is a season passes away unimproved. And what people recognized back in the 1700s, and a lot of people today, is when we grow something from seed, we have the opportunity to increase its genetic potential for the following year. This is a very important idea. When we go and buy seeds from seed packets year after year after year, we have foregone the opportunity to increase the quality of that plant that we're growing. Not only does the seed not get used to our soil, but it also doesn't get used to our fertilization program, our nutrition program. And so that we can actually make a healthier seed than when we started off by making sure that seed grows in the right environment. And so we lose the ability to improve the seed stock that we're using. And the other study that I wanted to talk about that supports this idea is Pat Pottinger's work with cats. And some of you, I'm sure, have heard of Pottinger's cats. And what Mr. Pottinger did was to do some studies with a whole bunch of cats. And what he did is he fed cats 3 different diets. He fed them a diet of the raw food that they're normally eating, some partially processed foods, and some just processed foods. And what he found is generation after generation, the cats that were fed the processed foods had very ill health. They became irritable. They had difficulties reproducing, and they just were in a demise year after year after year. And then he did something really cool. He took the cats that had degenerated for generation after generation, and then he started feeding them the raw diet that cats are used to eating. And guess what? He was able to see that subsequent generations, the cats returned to good health by eating those healthy foods. And so these ideas are really important in knowing that you can buy a seed or get a seed from a friend that knows what they're doing and start growing it. And by providing it the nutrition it needs and checking out these phases of development and giving it the nutrition it needs, you can actually improve the genetic potential of those seeds year after year. And heaven knows where you can take it. And so you don't have to rely on the poor quality seeds that many of us have available to us that we purchase, but we can not only get the seeds used to our soil and the biology in our soil, but also increase the genetic potential of those seeds year after year. So to summarize, the first thing is that we have this soil plant model, and models are really important. And it's these models that we can use and have in our mind that help us determine the processes and the decisions we make as we go forward. The first thing is that most soils' mineral proportions and biology is not optimum. And we have the opportunity to fix them if we want. The first thing is by long-term programs, but also there's a short-term program available to us. The next thing is that these plants, once they get healthy and they are in the nice soil and have the minerals that they need, they won't succumb to airborne pressures or insect pressures. And they start creating those components in them that we need for our health. And now I hope you realize that foliar spraying is the best short-term mineralization program that we have available to us, because not only are we feeding those important growth points of the plant, but we're also feeding the soil biology. We wouldn't do that because the plant is releasing 25% of the sugars that it makes in the leaf into the soil biology. And then this idea of homemade mineral amendments they're very simple to make. They're easy, low cost, closing waste gaps oftentimes. In fact, I would argue that you can make some of these fermented plant juice and vinegar extractions. You can make them in your kitchen in less time than it takes you to get in the car, drive to that store that you go to, and buy that stuff on the shelf and come home. You'll already have made it, and you know what's in it, and you know that it has all the things you need in it. And then these ideas of foliar spraying are absorbed directly into plants. Plants can absorb them very quickly and directly, and we can actually use characteristics of the plant to find the minerals we need, whether it's sassafras for photosynthesis efficiency, maybe it's cabbage because we grow a lot of cabbage and we want to feed our cabbage plants next year. Maybe it's skunk cabbage because it grows so quickly in the spring. Maybe we want to make fermented skunk cabbage and use that to foliar spray our plants. What characteristic is it that you're interested in facilitating in your plants, and what plants around you have those characteristics that you can use and harness for little or no money? Foliar sprays are just a great way to feed plants. They are quick. They compensate for shortcomings and stresses, and we can use them to affect different phases of growth. This is indeed the best short-term plant nutrition program available to us. So we can compensate for deficient soils and environmental stresses throughout the growing season by using these foliar sprays and using these homemade mineral amendments. And I would argue that this is sustainable agriculture. All right. So that's about enough out of me. Any questions?
So, yeah, Nigel, so we're going to go, I want to go quickly. There's a question online, and then we'll open it to the audience that's here in person. It says, how do I make a mineral extraction with vinegar? Recipe for dandelions, for example.
So, so you can do this. So the recipes are in, half of my book is a recipe book. So it's in there. I also have a YouTube channel, and my YouTube channel is free, and it's got all kinds of stuff in there on how to do these things. So you can do it there. And then I'll tell you really quickly, you take, the question was what, dandelions?
Correct.
Yeah, so dandelions, you want to use a sugar, an organic brown sugar, and you're going to mix the dandelions with about, if you're going to use dandelions, first of all, you want to pick your dandelions early in the morning so it still has all the dew and the moisture on them. And then you want to mix about 75% by weight organic brown sugar. You mix it up, you put it in a jar, and you forget about it. And after you put a little weight on the top to get the osmosis going, and within minutes or hours, you're going to see this brown juice start to be created. And you want to make sure that the juice, all of the plant material is below the juice after a day. You let it go for a week, and then you strain it without any weight. And again, the recipes are very simple. They're in my book. They're on my YouTube channel, and stuff like that.
Thank you, Nigel.
You're welcome.
Go ahead.
Thank you, Nigel. My name is Kathleen. I'm curious, and I'm going to ask a basic question. So since we talked about the dandelions, I don't know if you can hear me, but do you have to be concerned that you use the dandelions and, okay, we're the Northeast Food Organic Association. I don't look at it as wheat. I look at it as something I can eat, make tea with, but there's some people in my family that look at it as a weed if it's in their lawn. So do I have to be concerned when I use the dandelion in a foliar application to make sure that that extraction doesn't spread to a part of the lawn where or anywhere where it would become a nuisance to someone else? I wondered from that standpoint, especially the stinging nettles and the dandelions.
So I think your question is, should you be concerned about spraying these foliar sprays in parts of the lawn?
Well, actually, I'm going to spray it. I'm going to spray it and use it on the plants in a bed, a community bed, but there might be lawn around it. So some people would get upset and wonder if they're going to end up with stinging nettles or dandelions, and that becomes a nuisance. So
They should be so lucky.
compensate for that.
They should be so lucky. I have dandelions and stinging nettle growing in my garden. The reason is because that's what wants to grow in my garden.
Yeah.
And so I recognize that that's nature's way of bringing minerals to the surface. That's what the plants are doing. That's what the weeds in your garden are telling you. I don't know how you're going to spread it by using a foliar spray, but I actually allow dandelions to go to seed in my garden. As my soil changes, the dandelions are disappearing. They're just going because nature doesn't want to grow them there anymore. And I'm very disappointed, by the way, because I like to eat them as well. It's one of the more nutritious foods you're going to grow in your garden. Stinging nettle is probably the most nutritious thing you've got growing in your garden, I would argue. The next thing is that when I foliar spray my entire lawn. my entire ecosystem. It became clear to me long ago that I'm not just trying to increase the quality of plant life in my garden. I want my entire ecosystem to improve. I'm watching snakes and toads and frogs come into my lawn. I have the little, I live in a bright sunny area with all grass. There's no trees around. It's bright grass. I have newts running around my lawn now. The birds that are coming in, the meat-eating birds that are now eating my insects for me now. So the key is once you start doing this, you're promoting your entire ecosystem, and you're going to be amazed at what happens and the different life forms that come into your garden. This year, I had a moose in my garden eating my beans.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Does that answer your question?
It does, but I could just tell you personally, not me. I love the dandelion and the stinging nettle. Matter of fact, I harvest them from my neighbor's lawns in my neighbor's, wooded areas. But there's just this perception of them that unfortunately in an area where I live in South Jersey, where I like to call it the Blue Aquifer Coast, where they think you have to kill them and get rid of them. So I think I know I don't have fear and no. That's why I come to know, because I'm like-minded people. But I just was curious from the standpoint of I'm going to have to work with some of those people to explain to them that when you put it on the leaves with foliar application, you're not going to spread it and get those,
Oh, no.
per se. You're using those weeds as a beneficial. So,
Yeah, the liquid has nothing to do with dandelion reproduction or growth. It's just, you're just extracting the minerals from it. Yeah, you're not propagating dandelions here by any stretch of the imagination.
I know, but I'm gonna have to make a T-shirt or something to show that, I'm not getting them. I'm actually using those minerals. So
Right.
Yeah.
Instead, right?
Yes.
But thank you. I appreciate that.
Yep.
So Nigel, I want to move on to a question on the chat here, and it says, what instrument did you use to evaluate the mineral content of the foliar spray? And I also want to add an extension to that also. And did you analyze the extract itself or the final dilution?
Good. So I spent a lot of time looking for a lab that would help me to analyze the extraction. I analyze the extraction. So once the fermented plant juice vinegar extraction, leaf mold biology, leaf mold fermentation, whatever it is that I'm making, I analyze the final product that I put it on a jar and put on my shelf. I do not measure the dilution. So I spent a lot of time looking for labs that would do this analysis for me, do all of the 18 minerals, and I finally found one. I use Logan Labs for that. And one of the most important things in any kind of data set is to eliminate sources of variation. And so I use one lab. I always use that lab. And on my website, you're invited to use Logan Labs as well and do your own analysis. You can pull down a form from my website, and you can either go through Logan's lab yourself and do the analysis, or you can do it through me. And if you do it through me, then I'll publish the results on my website so everybody around the world can see it. And that's a whole nother conversation.
Right in back here.
I have two quick questions. What's the name of your website and your YouTube channel and your book?
My book is The Regenerative Grower's Guide to Garden Amendments. My website is nigel-palmer.com. If you just type Nigel Palmer, it'll come up. And you can get to my YouTube channel from my website. I have no idea what my YouTube channel is. I'm not that good. But you can get to it from my website as well. You can also purchase my book on my website through Chelsea Green, which is the publisher of my book. I highly recommend them over that larger store that most people use.
Yeah, and I believe if anybody has downloaded the Hoover app, all that information that Nigel just mentioned, is his book website is all on there as well.
And you mentioned another book.
Jadam, that's Jadam. Yep. I think it's, what is it, Jadam Soil or Jadam? Jadam book, actually.
Yeah, Jadam has a couple of books out. I found the first one to be more along the information that I was interested in. I find it a little bit difficult to read, but I think it's a great book and well worth looking into.
Okay. I want to alternate here, and I want to go on to the another question here from Deb. Does foliar spray help reduce the potential for nutrient runoff to our water bodies, or is there similar to other nutrients applications in respect to runoff?
Yeah, so that's one of the coolest things about these products is there's no poison, there's no deleterious effect to the runoff. It's just going to feed the soil's ecosystem. One of the things that people may or may not recognize is not only do the plants need these different minerals in the proportions and forms that they are in, but the soil biology needs these minerals as well. So the runoff that goes into the soil is going to do nothing more than feed the soil biology. It's sustainable. These are sustainable regenerative practices. There's no waste, there's no pollution, there's no deleterious effects.
Awesome. In the back, Chris?
So a couple quick questions. One, is there any plants that you're aware of that might have allelopathic qualities if you spray them as a fermented plant juice? That's question one. If there's any potential plants like black walnut, we know, underground has allelopathic qualities. I wonder if there's certain plants, especially ones that are really aromatic, like herbs, that might have that same effect on underground plants.
Yeah, great. What was I couldn't understand the word, the characteristic that you were asking about. Could you repeat that?
Allelopathic, detrimental to other plant growth.
Yes. Okay. So the answer is, yeah, you hit it on the head. Black walnut's a good example of that. Maybe if you're going to make a vinegar, an extraction of black walnut, you might want to put it on the fungus of your toes, for instance, rather than your plant. But so the answer is yes. And that's what's really cool about this whole idea is we're using plant characteristics. I should mention that another resource that's also in the appendix of my book is James Duke's database. Anybody familiar with James Duke? Put that on your list. James Duke was a researcher. He died about 2 or 3 years ago, but he did extensive research on the minerals that are in plants. He cataloged some 2,000 plants and listed the minerals that are in them. And that was one of the first places that I found the inkling that plants had all these minerals in them, and I might be able to extract them and then analyze them and show that it's all there. So James Duke database, phytochemical and ethnobotanical database, FDA. Yeah, that's a real great database for that sort of information. And so you're absolutely right. The whole idea here is what characteristic are you interested in harnessing and then finding the plants that exhibit those characteristics.
Awesome.
Hi, my name is Babette, and I have a question about trees. So, can you say anything to the to foliar extractions from trees, tree leaves, tree bark, and for trees, particularly nut and fruit trees, and also thinking about that trees prefer fungal dominated soil life as opposed to bacterial. I think a lot of the plants you talked about are annual vegetables. So that was one question. And a very short side question is, can you say anything about goldenrod? Because I have a ton of goldenrod in my kitchen.
Yeah. First of all, goldenrod, if you've got goldenrod in a growing space, I'd ferment it and find out what the heck's in it and use it. I'll give you an example. A lot of people have quackgrass growing in their gardens. A lot of people complain, oh, quackgrass, it's terrible, this and that and the other thing. Well, I have a different spin on it. If quackgrass is growing in your garden, then that's what your garden needs. And so what did I do with the quackgrass that was growing in my garden? Anybody want to guess? That's right. I fermented it. And then I analyzed it. And I found it was loaded with trace minerals. It's absolutely loaded. It's like one of the best things you can possibly have. So when you have weeds in your garden or farm or your whatever it is telling you, this is what I need. And so if I had goldenrod growing in a garden space that I wanted to grow vegetables, I'd make fermented plant juice out of it, and then I'd ferment it, and then I'd analyze it, and then I'd recognize what was in that, and I'd find that it was probably loaded with the minerals that I need in that garden space. The second question, the first question was on nut trees, I think it was. Let me try and, I think I understood what you said. Let me take a try at it, and then you can tell me how far off I was. Definitely for nut trees, fruit trees, I make fermented plant juices of the fruit or the nuts that come off those trees. And I will feed my trees those products in conjunction with the vinegar extractions to facilitate the phases of development of that tree. Again, I talked about that perennial section, and so I'm using all of these ideas to feed those trees throughout the growing season. And now I'm sure I didn't catch the nuance of your question. Perhaps you'd try again, and if I missed it.
I think the answer of using the fruits or the nuts with foliar spray is really great.
Yep.
The other part of my question was that trees tend to grow in a soil ecology dominated by fungus as opposed to bacteria. I guess you're talking about minerals. I guess my question was, is there anything special about promoting fungal dominated soil for trees?
Yeah, so the answer is I wouldn't go about promoting fungal dominated biology. I would go about promoting biology and let the tree decide what it wants and how much fungal bacteria or archaea is in there. We don't know enough about the different types to those decisions. And trees are a hell of a lot smarter than I am when it comes to determining what they want. So my approach to feeding nurturing the biology under a tree is to give it all the biology I can possibly give it, as diverse a biological component as possible. In conjunction with that, I'll give it minerals. In conjunction with that, one must recognize that if you want a strong bacterial, fungal, or archaea type environment, you want a strong biological environment, you must provide the housing and the food to support that biology. This is the thing that most people miss when they talk about soil biology. They miss the fact that they have to provide the environment for that biology to thrive. And how do you do that? That's carbon. Carbon is the food, and carbon will break down to create humus, which is the housing. And so underneath my fruit trees and any kind of tree, shrub, mostly trees, I have huge amounts of carbon going down there. And not thick. I don't want it thick such that it prevents air. I want tilth too, right? So I get constantly, I'm going to give it carbon, and that could come in the form of compost. It could come in the form of a thin, very thin layer of carbon in the form of leaves or wood chips. One of the best things you can feed your trees is seaweed. Seaweed not only has the carbon in it, but it also has the mineral component in it. For anybody that's lucky enough to live near the sea or is in with driving distance of the sea, seaweed is just an absolute winner for feeding trees as well. So again, don't try and guess what your tree wants. Give it diverse biology. The leaf mold biology recipe in here on page 237, I just made that up. I don't know what page it's on. It's very simple to make. It's cheap. It's free. You can make, all you need is a handful of leaf mold from the woods, some potatoes in a bucket, and you can make leaf mold biology that is so full of biology. It represents the maximum diversity of biology that you can possibly find, and it's free in your backyard.
Thank you.
I wonder if you've ever done any side-by-side comparisons using any of your foliar sprays, and just if you could talk about any anecdotal evidence you saw and its taking impact. And I ask partly because foliar spraying takes time and our energy. So I guess I'm wondering sort of like what you've really noticed.
Yeah, so you can, there's a bunch of things here. Let me start with using a refractometer to measure the effect of your foliar spraying. You can use a refractometer to actually see the Brix levels increase in a plant after you foliar spray. You can do that by using side-by-side trials where you measure the refractive index of 6 of these plants and 6 of those plants in different blocks, and then apply the foliar spray to one of them and not the other one, and watch the resulting change in bricks as a result of that. The other thing is you're going to find that in most instances, the health of the plant will immediately react. That's the thing that's really fun about this. You might talk, it takes time, but it takes a hell of a lot less time than it does to compost and mulch and add things year after year after year. You're going to see an immediate response in most cases to the health of the plant when you foliar spray. My own experience, I use foliar spraying because my soil is terrible. I live at 1,100 feet in Connecticut. I have glacial moraine, and that's the only thing that's happened here for 10,000 years. I don't have a stream bed that's putting nutrients in. I'm stuck with this moraine. And so I recognize I have to have long-term strategies to increase organic matter and tilth and calcium and blah, blah, blah. But by foliar spraying, I get immediate responses to my plants. Perhaps the most satisfying response to a plant is, for instance, when I grow potatoes. When I foliar spray, I have eliminated any insect pressure from potato beetles, for instance. And when I see potato beetles show up, I foliar spray and they just sit by my plant and they won't eat the plant. They just don't even bother it because I know I'm getting it the nutrition it needs. And when I slack off, then the potato beetles will move in and start eating them. And so there's both anecdotal and scientific evidence that you can use in order to satisfy the efficacy of these products. Again, that's all in the book. The book is a toolbox with all of these kinds of ideas in it that you can use as an experimental gardener and get off the ground and do these things yourself. I'm not here to tell you how to do it, what to do it. I'm here to suggest that there's a whole toolbox out there that's available to all of us that we all can use. And I recommend you checking them out and becoming experimental gardeners yourself.
Any more questions?
Can you use dried plants to make the fermented juices? If you're in the winter and you want to make a preparation to start your seedlings, can you use dried fruit?
Yeah, I didn't catch that one at all. I'm sorry. Could you try again or somebody interpret?
Yeah, so Nigel, so the question is, can you use dried plant material to create this fermented plant juice?
Got it. The easy answer is no. We're relying on the moisture in the plant to be removed through osmosis and create this liquid. So you want to capture plants very early in the morning when there's the most amount of dew and moisture in the plant as possible. Think about the xylem flow again, and when it's hot out and sunny out, that water is just flowing right through the plant and out. Early in the morning, that xylem flow is at a minimum, and that's when you're going to get the most amount of moisture in the plant. So the answer is no, I would not use dried plants. I mean, if that's all I had, I might come up with a way to use it. But in general, best practice is to try and gather plants in the morning before the sun comes up and make your fermented plant juice from that.
Could you purchase, organic dandelion greens in the winter and do it with that?
So I don't purchase anything. And the reason I don't purchase anything is the fundamental precept that I'm trying to eliminate pesticides, herbicides, and all the nasty things that go on things. And there's no guarantee, even when you purchase organic products, that it has some weird junk on it.
Yeah.
And so the easy answer is my recommendation is go to New Jersey and find that guy growing dandelions that doesn't like them and ask them. In fact, that's something that I've done. I've actually drive around on my motorcycle and I see somebody pulling dandelions out of their lawn and I stop and say, hey, do you use pesticides or herbicides? No, I just don't like dandelions. And I said, well, do you mind if I have your dandelions? Right. And I'll use those, or else I'll use them out of my own garden.
I was just thinking, in the winter, as mentioned before.
Well, that's the whole thing here is once you adopt this policy, what you're going to find is this spring, you're going to look at dandelions all different and you're going to make it. And so this is a process. All right. There's no silver bullets in agriculture. It's a process. It's a way of life. And we go around the sun once a year and you get an opportunity each year. So you're going to start making these things. And guess what? Next spring, you're going to be looking at those dandelions and you're going to grab them and you're going to have quart jars of them this time next year on your shelf that you're going to be able to use. So it's a long-term process here.
I'm the girl from New Jersey. that She will be gathering them and I'll bring them to the notebook conference next year to share.
Awesome.
I was just curious about mullein, if you use mullein, or you didn't mention it, but I know it's a good meat.
Yeah, mullein's a great plant for all kinds of things. Again, mulleins one of the plants that I have growing in my garden. We use it for its herbal characteristics, both for the lungs as well as for ears and things like that. But I have not fermented it, but I'm sure you could. And it would be very interesting to find out what's in it. You know, so if you think of the biodynamic herbs, right? The comfrey and nettle and horsetail and yarrow and things like that. So those are good places to start. Mugwort, motherwort, dandelion, and then especially if you have crops, if you've got a single type of crop that you're growing, or a fruit or a berry, right? Those are winners. I mean, you can't lose.
I don't see an immediate question, so I'll ask one myself. When collecting plants, any considerations that you want to make for a plant, collecting a plant during its vegetative state versus flowering, and then considerations on foliar feeding as well? You know, are there other than minerals, there are enzymes that are extracted along this process? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, that's a really good comment. And the answer is yes. All of these things matter. We talked about plant phases of development, and we talked about the need for different minerals for those plants during those different phases of development. Well, in fact, during those different phases of development, the plant has different concentrations of minerals in them. For instance, if you're going to ferment a dandelion, let's say, or a nettle, doing it at the very end of the season in the fall, you're going to get an entirely different mineral composition than you are in the spring. So I would encourage things like that to make your fermented plant juices in the spring when that plant is young and vibrant. These are pretty standard herbalist type notions, if you will. And so they apply here as well. We know that a lot of the energy in plants goes into the roots in the fall. And also stinging nettle, for instance, is thought to be more agitating than nutritive in the fall when you're drinking the tea. So the answer is yes. Different phases of plant development will give different types of mineral composition. And so I suggest the spring in most cases. And the other thing is, since we're talking about it, plants next to a superhighway might not have as clean a mineral composition as those in the depth of the woods or on a little tiny dirt road. So considering the life cycle of all of the things that you're going to use for mineral extraction is very important. When you consider the bones that you're going to use for making vinegar extraction of bones, in our house we use grass-fed pastured cows for making bone broth, and after that bone broth is made, then Joan gives me the bones, and then I'll cook them and get the water out and get the organic matter off them. And that's what I'm going to make my vinegar extraction of bone. Shrimp, I want it to come from the ocean, and oysters from the ocean. When I think of fish, I use bluefish, really oily fish like bluefish and mackerel and things like that. So yeah, the source of anything that you're going to use here is going to end up in the garden. Even when we talk about manure, for instance, I interview the cows before their manure goes on my ground because I want to know their living environment. I want to know what they're eating. I want to know if they need antibiotics regularly and what frequency before those things go into my garden.
Great, thank you. I want to go to one more question here on the chat, and I'll go with you here quickly. And this question is for Noreen. I'm going to try to read this, but Noreen, actually, can you actually come off of mute and ask the question? If not, I can actually try to repeat this. So the question's on the chat and it says, what about putting in compost pile versus making foliar spray? I realize foliar is on the spot feeding, but I think some value in compost.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I like to, sorry, I usually include this in my conversation. Let's take eggshells, for instance. So how many people had eggs for breakfast? All right. Okay. What happened to those eggshells? How many people threw them away? Yeah. How many people put them on their compost pile? And then how many people made vinegar extractions out of them? Okay. So now let's take that life cycle of that eggshell. So if I take those eggshells and I put them on the compost pile, in my compost pile, I like my compost pile to digest for a year. I want fungal digestion. I want humification to take place. I want that humus and that structure to take place. So I want fungi to decompose my compost. And so those eggshells, they're going to sit on my compost pile for a year, and then they get onto the soil, and they might take months in order to get from the soil into the plant. And so it's a great idea. I do it. That's where a lot of my eggshells end up. But in addition to that, I'm going to make vinegar extraction of eggshells. So I've got that jar of it sitting on a shelf. So it's not a question of A or B, it's both. Both of them are different strategies. And now this is the whole idea of this soil model, the soil plant model, is what am I doing? I recognize that I can, in the soil plant model, I can put them into the compost pile and they'll get into the soil. I also recognize that I can make a foliar spray out of them and apply them to my soil. So it's just like a good dessert. When somebody asks me, do I want apple pie or ice cream? The answer is easy, both.
Right. So I want to go to one more last question here. I want to be mindful of the time. So go ahead.
Do you make foliar sprays with moss or lichens?
I'm sorry, I didn't catch that.
The question is, do you make any foliar sprays with moss or lichen?
No, I don't, but what a great idea, right? What characteristic are you harnessing with a moss or a lichen? That's a great, great idea. And I encourage you to give it a shot. And please, if you're interested, let's do some analysis and we'll publish it so that everybody in the world can figure that out. Maybe just as closing, I'd just like to say thank you for having me on your program here today. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you. I do encourage you to check out my website and to check out the analysis of the minerals there. There's podcasts there, and there's links to YouTube, so you can see a lot of these things. I also reach people all over the world and have conversations that with people all over the world that come to this conversation to talk about their successes and failures using these ideas. And I encourage you all to seek out this kind of information, not just from my website, but from others that are doing the same thing. These are truly sustainable agricultural ideas that are taking hold around the world.
Great. Nigel, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, everybody.